Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Just One Thing live broadcast. My name is Lalita Vasudevan, and I am the Vice Dean for Digital Innovation here at Teachers College. And we are sitting here in the beautiful Smith Learning Theater in the fourth floor of the Gottesman Libraries. And we are here for the purpose of celebration, for the purpose of discussion, for the purpose of reflection on many things, including these 5 films that we're going to discuss today. I am also here on behalf of the Digital Futures Institute, which was launched in December of last year. And it was envisioned as a hub to spark digital innovation in the areas of pedagogy, research, and public engagement. And we're so happy that these 4 colleagues who are sitting around here with me, and Michelle Trochet, who we'll talk about in a minute, agreed to take us up on an invitation. They agreed to take us up on an invitation to not only reflect on the past year, on the pandemic, on what life has been like, but they took us up on an invitation to do that on video in the form of a series of short films. And where they took us was on several journeys of inquiry, of learning, of reflection, and truly of education in the broadest and most Deweyan sense of the word. We're going to start with a clip of Pam's film on food access equity.
We have learned this year that our food supply is fragile. Those images of empty shelves in grocery stores from March and April 2020 are burned into our memory. The COVID-19 pandemic triggered serious breakdown in the steps involved in getting food from plants and animals on farms to our grocery stores. At the same time, we saw the number of people who lacked resources to get food soar. The response was swift. Government responded in many ways, one of which was to make school meals grab and go and open to everyone, both children and adults. This worked to quickly get meals to people precisely because there are schools in all communities. This was all put into place when we did not know how to be safe from COVID-19 and cases were rapidly rising. Why did we have this massive and rapid response? Because everyone needs to eat each and every day. We cannot take a break from eating just because there is an emergency. We need a food safety net to ensure everyone can eat every day, no matter what.
So the format we've settled on today is each of our participants selected a clip for one of the other participants in this series. And today, Nathan's going to kick us off with a question for Pam.
Hey, Pam, thank you very much for this excellent video. I think it's a great place for us to start, too. One of the things that really struck me in your video, you mentioned pretty early on that food insecurity is a collective responsibility, that this is not about individual choices that are being made. And later in your video, Tony Hillary, kind of repeats this, saying that we have this assumption often that there's those people, it's somebody else's kids. But in reality, COVID made it very clear to all of us that this was a systemic problem. And it is, it's a systemic problem. It's a really, really hard problem, but it's a problem that we absolutely have to be addressing and trying to solve. And so I wonder if you could, give us some advice or some suggestions about how, each of us, not just researchers and scholars, but people who are friends and who are neighbors of others, what can we be doing to start addressing this problem?
Thank you so much, Nathan, and thank you for everyone being here tonight. I want to say if you haven't gotten to see the whole film yet, make sure you do, because Tony is actually really great in it and he wasn't featured in this clip tonight. So thanks again, Tony, for being part of this. So Nathan, to get to your question, I actually think one of the first things that's really important is to raise awareness that not everyone has food all the time. Maybe a lot of us in this room have never had to think about where our next meal is coming from and have always been able to get foods that we believe would be healthy for us and healthy for our families. And maybe there's some people in this room who that's not, or watching online, that's not true for, that have struggled to get enough food, or do live in communities where it's really hard to get health promoting foods. And I think being aware of that and then realizing for everyone who doesn't have enough food, it's because it is, as you said, a system problem. It is not individual responsibility. Many scholars write a lot about what it would be like if we had a rights-based approach to food. And so just imagine that for a second, that it was just commonplace that everywhere you went, there would be really good, healthy food. There would be culturally relevant food for everyone that was around. And it's just a really, really different way to think about it. So I think raising that awareness is really important. The other thing that's important and related to this is there is many food insecure teachers college students, and I have met many of them. We have a food pantry at Columbia that was actually started by a Columbia student that's at Lerner Hall, and we have teachers college students who are using that because they don't have enough resources for food.
I'm intrigued, Pam, to hear you say a little bit about sort of the connection between this really global issue and the hitting home piece. And I wonder if you could say something about what it was like to use this project to call attention to this issue.
Well, thank you. That's a great question. I think, when I got the invitation, and as you said, we responded to an invitation, I really thought a lot about how, and what was said in the clip is because everyone needs to eat every day. Other things we could take a little bit of time to figure out in this new world what to do, but we didn't have that wasn't an option for food because people needed to eat. And so it ended up really elevating and putting a spotlight on a lot of issues that already existed. Truthfully, if we had had a really good system before and it was equitable and everyone had access to good food, it wouldn't have been such a problem. It was such a problem because there were so many people just on the brink. And then there was just, there was, as we all know, everything had to change really quickly. And so I believe that spotlight can help us to continue to think about the role that food plays for all of us. I actually believe this school year, almost every principal, probably around the world, has had to think more about school meals than they had to before. And it's where do students get their food? Where do they eat their food? That may be the only time they're taking off their masks. How is that done in a safe way? And I believe that our school meals in this country can become something that we are all proud of and that is a really wonderful educational experience for children to learn about, model what we want to do. And that's the case in some places in the world. It's not the case in the United States yet. And I believe that that's something that can happen. So this gave me the opportunity to do that.
That's a really interesting moment to kind of pivot because I think this idea of what are the contexts in which we gather was really put to the test this year. And when we sent out the call to say, is anyone interested in reflecting on this year? One of the things Nathan submitted was a project idea to say, you know what, it isn't just context of living that have really been transformed, but context of learning, right? So learning looked really different last year. So we're gonna take a moment now to shift to episode 2, which is focuses on sort of Nathan's reflections on reimagining learning environments.
Despite the fact that it was overwhelming, and despite the fact that the amount of time that my wife and I had to sort of devote to what our kids were thinking about and doing during the day before school kind of returned in this online form, the space of possibilities of what they could explore was wide open. The space of possibilities of how they could explore it was also wide open. We could come up with all sorts of crazy, interesting ideas for activities that the kids could do, or conversations they could have, or projects that they could make. And I think we actually had a really exciting opportunity to try that out at the beginning of this pandemic, and we saw little flashes of that, in individual families or in individual pods or in maybe some communities. But the nature of the crisis that we were all facing, the nature of the balancing of work and home life that was really impossible for most families across the world, and the fact that school has a tough time of thinking of learning beyond the usual resources that we find in classrooms or school buildings. That all kind of reasserted itself. And so what we're left with when we think about online learning or remote learning is something that resembles a great deal kind of the more traditional classrooms that we find well before the pandemic, and unfortunately will probably return in full force once school returns after this is over.
Jackie?
Thank you, Aletha. And Nate, I loved your video so much. It was great to see your family so just together in that time. And I think it reminds us that there was a lot of togetherness, even though it was such a difficult time.
There was a
little
lot
too
of
much.
togetherness.
Togetherness.
A lot.
I really did appreciate this point about possibility, though. And it might be a little counterintuitive to some of the parents who actually struggled with having their children at home. But, you know, there is something about rethinking learning environments that I find to be so valuable in your video. And I wondered if you could spend a little time just telling us about what you imagine. You know, what is that ideal learning environment? It's so funny. It's actually a question that I asked students at the start of the semester in one of my classes, and I asked them to think about who is there, you know, not just what the learning environment looks like, but who is there, you know, parents, teachers, students, what is there, what are the expectations, how might you rethink some of those really rigid structures that we seem to have fallen back into for the sake of getting back to normal. So what are you imagining could be possible?
Yeah, so thanks for that. I mean, there's a lot that has been written on this, and there's a lot that each of us, I suspect, around the table feel about this as well, and have strong opinions. Certainly my research and the research that my students get to do is all about trying to ask that question and try to study that question. So, you know, I say all of that because one of the things that's worth remembering is that we actually kind of know what a good learning environments are. We kind of know what the right answer is to some of those questions. And some of those answers are the fact that we want the learning environment to be student-centered. It should be focused on the particular values and the perspectives and the interests and the passions of the young people that are in that space, in that learning space. It should be a place full of, you know, diverse materials and tools that can each kind of represent different ways of thinking and different ways of acting. It should be a place where there's just tons and tons of human support, you know, not just teachers and educators that are trained and professional and understand, you know, what good learning is and understand how to arrange those good learning moments, but also peers of all ages, not just peers that happen to have been born around the same time you were born, right? So we have a lot of those answers. We have a lot of those answers, but the ways in which schools are structured, we get so caught up, even though we know the right answers to these questions, we get so caught up in the structures that exist and the expectations that we think schools should have, right? The fact that it needs to fit in these four walls, that if the fact that, well, the tools I have available are desks, they're whiteboards, right? They're markers, there's books. You know, we have a difficult time thinking outside of those, even when we know what's best here.
And is there one quality of what your children experience that you'd like to bring back right now, that you maybe have seen them lost?
Oh, ooh,
Good one, huh?
yeah.
I mean, I was thinking back to the beginning of your video where your son was, you know, not really enthusiastic about the math that he was required to learn. And you figured out a way for him to get really enthused and engaged about it by making the questions important to him. So, you know, are there any kinds of questions or ideas that maybe you'd like to see him bring back into his learning?
I think math's a great example. Just it's one that always comes to my mind anyway. And I think when you ask a young person that's in school, what is math? They'll tell you about multiplication and sums and all that stuff. And you ask a mathematician what is math, and they'll tell you something else entirely different than what you hear a school child say. And I think that's maybe one thing. It's just this sense that math and other subjects, science and language, these things are so much more than the stuff in a textbook. There's so much more than the list of items on a worksheet, and that we can engage with them when we're stumbling across that cool flower that my daughter walked next to and then it stuck to. We can engage with it when we're wondering, what does it mean for what is exponential growth, and how does that play out in our environment, in our world?
One of the things I was struck by in your initial response to Jackie's question, you ended sort of with, the pandemic kind of revealed maybe what's possible.
Even whenever I'm trying to, engage my kids in some thing we might call learning, we so easily kind of fall into well, where does this fit into the school day? Where does this fit into which subject you may have had? And I think, but I also recognize that as a parent, and those of you who are parents, online or here, that you're also really good at helping your kids learn stuff, and you're constantly teaching them things, or you're constantly talking to them about things that they're interested in, sometimes when you don't want to be, but you're always, it's just a part of kind of how you are. And I think a mistake that we often make is thinking, I'm not a teacher, I don't know how to teach a kid. I don't know how to make sure they're learning about math. I don't know how to engage them with science. Their teachers know how to do that, but I don't. But I think we just need to remind ourselves constantly that we do know how to do this, and that learning is learning. It doesn't matter if learning is happening in a classroom or a school, or if learning is happening on the playground, or if learning is happening, just as you're sort of looking up at the sky, during the day. And to sort of free ourselves from this expectation that we need to think of learning as a school thing, and instead just be looking for moments around us.
I think the other piece that you kind of raised, you talked about the materials, right? Like what's available, how do people's roles get reimagined? And I think I'm gonna sort of slowly shift us now, because I think this idea of what are the conditions that inspire different ways of being, I think is so readily evident in Sonali's film. And, one of the things that we saw across these films, and it's highlighted very much in Sonali's, is what are the conditions of connection, the conditions of being in contact with people, the idea of being with and being co-present. And so we're going to watch now a clip from Sonali's film, and then we're going to hear Pam raise a question for her.
So this sounds almost very trite, I think, when I say it, but I think what the pandemic did for so many of us was highlight experiences, interactions, things that brought us happiness that we all just took for granted on a daily basis, and then all of a sudden those were gone. I live actually in the Teachers College neighborhood. My family and I are embedded in the Teachers College community that goes outside of just the TC buildings. And so, for example, I'll be walking my son to school and I'll run into one of my students. So there's all sorts of opportunities in various ways to just build connection and, I think, important relationships with our academic community. I think the informal interactions for me pre-COVID, I had never actively thought about until they were gone, but just the way in which students, would pop in and out of my office to borrow a book or to grab a snack, or they need a form signed. You have these moments to just connect and think. To have the ability to have these informal interactions allows us to just cultivate those relationships. So at least for me, it feels very organic and also really important.
Wow, what a clip. And, I want to actually connect this to Nathan's as well, because you said, which was true for all of us, whoever was our family or whoever we were with, and some people weren't with anyone, we were with a lot. And yet what we missed was those really small connections. And the editing of that is incredible, that, it really showed what we missed. So Sonali, now that we're back to being together, what do you think, how can we hold on to that appreciation of the small moments? Because I see myself losing that appreciation as we're back to some sense of normalcy. So how do we hold on to that and keep that sense of appreciation?
Okay, well, thank you, Pam. I just have to say that, so when I first told my husband about this project, I didn't even give him very much context, but I sort of briefly described it. And without missing a beat, he says, well, you're going to talk about how much you miss people. And I was like, well, that is 100% accurate. Or I had a student last week who submitted this like application for this fellowship, and she was like nervous, but also really excited about it. And like, she kind of just popped into my office just to share, like, again, like 30 seconds, just to tell me she had submitted it, which I was like, oh, I got to celebrate that like little moment with her, which was so nice. Or like going out to dinner. I was out to dinner like a few weeks ago with some of my like friends who are also my very good colleagues. And I did have a moment even in that meal where I was like, oh, this is like so great. We are here and we are together. And so I am definitely still like, and I had a lot of togetherness. Like my 6-year-old is like with me. I mean, the fact that he's not here right now is sort of shocking. The fact that he wasn't in Nathan's video is sort of shocking. So there was a lot of togetherness. And that was all very good. But I feel like those informal, both the intentional and sort of the unintentional ones, I miss that so much. And I think I was thinking about sort of the why of that. And there's lots of reasons why, of course, just, the nature of like being in this very stressful situation and everyone juggling a lot. But I do think that kind of like those sort of interactions that we have with one another in person, I think that humanizes academia in a way that I think gets lost when people sort of think about what academia is, which is like chasing the next grant or the next paper or the next analysis, which I'm like, all of that's super important and I care about a lot. But I feel like the people who you do that work with, or the people who you get to talk about these ideas with, I feel like that matters. Like, I think that's like the most important thing. I think about this op-ed piece that Lolita, Nathan, and Paolo wrote like a few months ago that literally emerged out of like being able to sit around and eat pizza with our kids. And like, it was like this like kind of informal conversations that like led to this like op-ed we ended up writing. And I think part of what I talk about in the video is also how generative those space like that, those moments can be. I think the work that I am personally most proud of has come out of those kinds of conversations, but also out of the relationships that have been built out of those interactions. I think that's happening here, like as faculty and scholars and members of like an institution of higher education, but it's happening in other spaces too. I mean, my 6-year-old who is wired just the same way I am. So, the joy he has at like going to school and being with other kids and teachers. And I really appreciated the way his first grade teachers are sort of considering, the last normal school here he was 3 years old, which is like literally half of his lifetime. So it is kind of wild to think about. I know it is wild to think about now him entering a first grade year where he's getting to see teachers and friends on a consistent basis and what that looks like. And I do feel like part of this time, at least for me, feels like making sense of that. In my world, in his world,
So I want to go back to, again, like, I think that the connections here are so interesting between the ways that we create conditions for the spontaneous interactions, right? And I think we did some conversations with faculty this past spring. And one of the things that kept coming up through each of the kind of focus group and drop-in conversations we had was, I miss the unplanned interaction.
Yeah.
And I think for those who aren't, I don't think that's true just of the university setting, but it's especially true, I think. And so, one of the things that Nathan and I were talking about in that op-ed discussion was that kind of frenetic energy with which some people were opining about this being the great ed tech experiment.
Yeah.
I will resist the soapbox. I know I've
send
opened
the
a
op-ed around
Pandora's
for
box.
everyone to read.
And there is a role for ed tech to play, right? Like there is a role for technology companies to play. But I think what this conversation shows, what these films show, what I think our experience, both the children's experience and our students' experience shows, is that it's not an either or. It is very much a both and conversation. And we have to have the imagination to think beyond the kind of existing categories to really push people to consider, how do we put these two pieces together? The sort of exigency with the kind of unpredictability, right? How do we get both of those pieces together? Do you want to say something, Sonali?
No,
Oh,
I'm waiting for Nathan. We were going to argue about this.
We
but
were.
but
No,
now you just-
there's plenty of time.
We can argue.
to
Nathan has,
argue.
Nathan, Lolita, I think there's there are people who I was lucky to see consistently through that. I will just say that I think that there was a lot of togetherness, but I think also that like that was also very sustaining. Like the few people we were able to interact with, I think also was like remarkably, just very helpful in lots of ways. So anyway.
No, I was just going to say, like, I think the other piece that I'll connect, and we're going to watch a clip from Michelle's film now, is that there was real significant advances in the use of technology to support access to health, right? And so we were really lucky when Michelle responded to this invitation that we put out to the community. And she wanted to create call awareness to the role that telehealth has played. She brought awareness, and she brought to people who've benefited significantly from this experience of being able to access health, access medical professionals through advances in technology. So what we're going to do is we're going to first thank Michelle for participating in this. We're sorry she can't be with us today, but we are going to take a clip. We are going to take a look at a clip from her film.
Because of the pandemic, many of us have experienced the feeling of needing or wanting to see a physician or other healthcare provider, but feeling that the risk is just too high to do so in person. And for many, that feeling is not new. For example, people with diseases that make it difficult to move around or which compromise their immune systems have always had to worry about the burden or even health consequences of going to the doctor. The major uptake in telehealth during the pandemic has also served as a necessary catalyst for increased research related to telehealth. Our lab is one of those groups now researching telehealth. We and many others have become particularly interested in the reliability of assessments via telehealth, their validity as compared to in-person services, and the feasibility of providing treatment which is comparable to in-person service via telehealth. How do we ensure that a modality which may have the possibility to increase access to quality healthcare does not actually result in greater healthcare inequity? And although it seems pretty straightforward, you have a phone or a computer and ta-da, you have great telehealth care, the reality is that we know there are plenty of barriers.
So we want to thank Michelle again for working with us to produce this film. And we're gonna pivot from this kind of broad question of kind of creating channels and conduits of interaction to a film that takes us on a meandering journey. You know, Jackie responded to us and she said, I think I want to make a film just about wandering. And it turns out that wandering took us all kinds of places. So we're going to take a look now at a clip from The Value of Wandering that features Jackie Simmons.
I remember going on my first walk at the start of the pandemic in early April. I had a doctor's appointment, so I felt as if I'd been given permission to be outside, but very few other people had emerged from quarantining, and I felt almost alone as I walked through Central Park. I was so shocked to see that while we were all indoors, spring had arrived. As I took a simple walk through that park, I was startled again and again by my senses. There was an assault of sounds from a cello player in that tunnel leading to Bethesda Fountain who could barely compete with the birdsong. It was so loud, I thought for sure there were thousands of birds nesting in the tunnel eaves. And then I found myself under an explosion of beautiful color from a blooming magnolia tree. I slowed my pace almost to the point of leisure, and I cried. It was such an emotional backdrop for so much grief and hope that I was holding in my body and in my mind. Wandering is not just about walking. It's any time we slow down, and when we remove expectations, and when curiosity leads to new motivations to wonder, to experience emotions, and perhaps learn something new.
I think Sonali has a question.
I do. I have to tell you, Jackie, I loved your video. It was so powerful. And it's just, I mean, all the videos are so well done. But what I love about it is there's just such a diversity of perspective here. And I guess my question for you, so in your video, you talk about holding grief and hope. And I I think that embodies exactly what so many of us have experienced over the past 20 plus months, grief of losing loved ones, of what our pre-COVID life was, and of, the many moments and experiences that we missed as a result of this pandemic. And and then also that hope that there is a path forward. And so I guess my question for you is, how has wandering helped you to make sense of those, I don't know if we call them conflicting emotions, but certainly two sort of weights to carry that are sort of maybe in conflict with one another?
Well, thank you so much. And before I answer that question, I have to thank the team here at DFI for helping me to put together that beautiful film. Jen and Angelica and Joe, it did require a lot of sort of revisiting space and doing some wandering again through a lot of those feelings and, the body and the emotions. And so I think the way I would answer the question is to really talk about how I consider all of those forms of knowledge. And we don't often get the opportunity to tap into the kind of knowledge that lives outside of textbooks, outside of what we think of as sort of the true content of the world, whatever your discipline is, or however we're thinking about school. So there was something about this wandering during the pandemic that really, and the slowing down, that really allowed me, and I think others who, to tap into these other ways of knowing that we tend to forget in the busyness of living life. I think that comes out in a lot of your other films that we've talked about tonight, whether it's appreciating the nourishment that we get from food or the nourishment that we get from people and our connections. And so all of that, I think, is difficult to tap into typically, but the wandering allows us to kind of release it. And I think it's because we're allowed to tap into our emotions. Grief and hope are essential, I think. I think they're just a part of life. And so, if we're spending time trying to avoid it all the time, then we're actually missing out on a lot of opportunities to connect to the world, to connect to what we want to learn in lots of different ways. So, I think of wandering as a practice in that way. And, I have to say that, we've been actually working with this in our curriculum lab. We have a curriculum lab here in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching, and we met during the pandemic and all of our meetings were on Zoom. So we had to figure out ways of connecting with each other and in our individual spaces. And sometimes that meant wandering through our homes and through our things, or having prompts where we would go off and wander in our own communities and then come back and report on the different kinds of things that we'd learned. And, I think it's in some ways, it's an underrated way to think about what's going on when we're actually integrating new knowledge into how we understand the world.
I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or even suggestions for how we sort of continue to keep that space, because there's still so much that we're processing. The grief has not gone away. I do think there's a sense that we should be moving on, and there's like an impatience and a restlessness, but I also feel like we can do that, but only if we're allowing the time and space to process all of what has happened.
And I think that's part of what wandering allows us to do, is to not fixate on whatever our construction of normal is, because that maybe didn't serve us so well, right? Maybe it did. Maybe there are some things that we want to keep from that, but how will we ever know what other possibilities there might be in any of these fields where we do our research and do our work, if we're not allowing ourselves the time and the space to, not have planned learning, not necessarily know what the outcome is supposed to be. And I don't think it has to take a lot of time, actually. You can give yourself, we should all do it right now, 60 seconds to just, and it doesn't, again, it's not necessarily a physical movement, right? It could just be allowing your mind to settle and to be in touch with your body. So, if we can do it, we're not going to do this for 60 seconds, but one of the practices that we used in the curriculum lab was to turn off your camera and for 60 seconds, let your eyes wander and not move your body, just stay in the chair that you're in, let your eyes wander around and allow it to fixate on something, and maybe be curious, maybe ask a question about what you see. Maybe it wanders onto something else. And all of a sudden you start seeing things in your everyday typical environment that you maybe have never noticed before. Maybe you start noticing juxtapositions that raise a question or surface a new line of inquiry or a curiosity that you want to explore by researching new knowledge.
Yeah, just to bring that into too, I mean, your point about noticing is, I think, such an important one. The wandering lets you go somewhere where you haven't been before and gives you permission to see things new, but that's sort of like looking at things and looking closely. I was thinking when we were talking about, learning, there's this sense that, one thing that's important is we want to create space and time for people to go deeply in stuff they're really passionate about and excited by. But another thing is recognizing that we are constantly just kind of meandered and taken over by these new ideas or these new things that come into our field of vision. And that's what I love about your video. This idea of wandering is not just making time to move, but also just allowing yourself to kind of flow with whatever takes you in that particular moment. And that's such an important part too of learning.
Yeah, and I just have to note that not only are children really good at that, but so are artists, so are creators, so are designers, right? There's some part of those fields where it's quite normal and natural to do this kind of wandering. And then there are other fields for which it seems really taboo. So let's just sort of open ourselves up to thinking about how it might benefit all of us a little bit.
There's a question, there's a couple questions that have come in, and I think it's a really good kind of moment to open up the conversation to really think across these films. And so I'm going to read the first one, and they both sort of have a resonance with each other. And so Lisa Wright says, how do we carry these just one things with us as we move forward? And how do we integrate this into our teaching with graduate students? So any takers on that?
I mean, I feel like it's like we want to write like we should be reimagining our classrooms and giving space and time to wander and like hugging each other as much as we can. And that's clearly the takeaway. And, but like there's even Pam's question to me, which is like, how do you not like take for granted this? But like, I hate to say that this is like an act of practicing gratitude because that feels very like trite almost, but I do think there's something to be said for realizing that we have been able to come through this messiness in a way, and that there are things that it may not make sense to bring them to our practice and to our teaching and to our work all day, every day, but certainly like recognizing that, it like what was and what is like, I don't know. I'm not sure if that even makes sense, but I do think creating that space, like the 60 seconds. I love that actually, because it doesn't actually take very long to kind of like reset or reframe one's perspective. It's like, so I don't know.
I mean, what I was thinking, again, to go back to food, but is in Japan, when children get school lunch, they actually say, they thank the people who grew the food, and they thank the people who prepared the food. So maybe one thing that we can take is to realize, especially now that we have all become more aware because of food shortages, of the food supply chain, that whatever you eat, there were a lot of people involved all along the way, and to appreciate that. And in some way, it doesn't have to be a prayer or anything like that, but in some way say, wow, somebody somewhere worked to create this. And honestly, some of our farm workers are in the most dangerous, lowest paying jobs that we have. And so I think thinking about that too.
Yeah, I think each one of these films videos has a sort of a value. And I think, we can sometimes think about having really specific practices that we implement as a way to institute a new idea, but we can also just think about, what are the principles or values that actually just guide our teaching choices or our educational thoughts. And including any one of these, I think is one of those values, allows you to remember and then make different kinds of choices along the way.
So here's a question that really resonates with something that I've been wanting to ask you all, but Patricia, who's our colleague here, Martinez Alvarez, asks in a much more elegant way. First, she says, thank you for these wonderful videos and the discussion. Thanks, Patricia. I wonder, she says, were the videos vehicles to understanding your own experiences as scholars and as human beings during these difficult pandemic times? It's really a question about the medium here.
Oh,
and what the
yes.
experience was. Yeah, let me hear it.
So I haven't talked about this yet here, but I do talk about it in the video, which is that the in-person connection of doing the so I think there's a lot of us at TC and other places who do we're all studying really challenging, sad issues, or difficult issues, and whatever it might be on issues of social justice or anything that we're looking at. It's inevitably, I think, going to be challenging here. And the nature of the work that I do is it's sad, it's traumatic, it can be very dark, for lack of a better term. And the ability, and so this is in the video, but the making of the video helped me articulate this in a way that I hadn't been able to before, which is that the ability to do that work and to do it in a way that doesn't like consume you, right, constantly, is entirely because of the sort of the personal connections I have and the collaborative nature of my colleagues who I do that work with, in that they are colleagues, many of whom are here, are who I can process with, right, and reflect on something with, or make sense of a data set with, or think through something that is, again, just really challenging and hard. And I think that for me has always been there and present, but like the value of that, I don't think I had ever really spelled out in such a specific way until we made this video. And I was like, poor Joe's interviewing me for this video, and I'm just crying to Joe on the phone. Thank you, Joe. On my video, just trying to make sense of that, because I do think I think about the work we all do, whether it's in schools or with kids or with vulnerable populations, and on issues that are just so hard, right? And here and present, and kind of to Nathan's point, it's work that is also sometimes make you angry. Why do I have to do this work? Because these problems are just sometimes so bad. And I think there's a way in which the in-person connection piece for me allows that work to happen. So for sure, Patricia, beautiful question. And 100% I felt that in the process of doing that.
I felt that as well. And I would definitely agree that there was a lot of processing going on. I think I probably fully cried through one whole take. And then we decided not to use that one. But I also know, in addition, I think it's both, because, I've been working on these ideas, and I think I presented these ideas around wandering in at least 2 different talks throughout the past year and during the pandemic. They were Zoom talks. And the filmmaking, however, was just another way to communicate those ideas as a way of presenting research, as a way of presenting ways that I want people to start thinking about curricula. And so I think film is actually a really useful modality for curriculum. And so there is a lot, I think, that's communicated through each one of these pieces that, sure, you'll probably also read about in a research paper, and you'll probably also hear about in a lecture. But there is an ability to have an emotional connection with each of these authors in a way that is just not possible if you're lecturing. And so the film itself, and that's why I love this series so much. The products themselves, I think, are their own outcome, right? I think it's been really important to see that.
I think film as a medium allows for all of that, because it really is about taking something and bringing people through an arc of emotions. And I think that the 3 that we've been talking about here, anger, grief, and hope, and through the medium of film. And I think that the editing that the team did on these really was able to bring that out. And so I think the process of thinking about that, it wasn't just about, for any of us, what we wanted to say. It was, what were we doing for an audience to have them go through an emotional experience and hopefully be touched enough by that to hang on to something that they'll take with them.
If you had to do it over again, not the pandemic, but these films. Would any of you have chosen a different one thing? Or is there a different one thing that resonates with you?
No, but I will say that one of the great delights in watching these 5 videos is every time you saw one, it was like, yes,
that.
oh,
Exactly.
I had that
Yes.
too.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
exactly
I
right.
did that, or you just felt like you could completely connect with those. So no, but I would have done, I would have liked to have done all 4 of the other ones that I didn't do, because they were also kind of important.
Yeah, I'm going to +1 that.
Plus 2. If that were a tweet, Nathan, I would have hearted it. Um, Yeah, no, it's a good question. And maybe to say something different. I mean, I obviously did something very, very much, and I think everyone's was related to their profession, but mine was very rooted in my profession. And I think, one of the things I personally learned, and I had a few pretty traumatic things happen to me during these 20 months, was resilience and a deeper inner strength. And, now after seeing everyone else's, I think I would have said, well, wow, how could I have told my story of what I went through?
That could be series 2, Pam. I don't know. We might have to put out a call. I'm gonna do a little bit of 60 seconds of wait time, maybe 20 seconds, see if anybody who's in our studio has a question that I overlooked. Not to put anybody on the spot. All right.
They've all wandered.
They've all wandered.
They've wandered out.
Studio, YouTube audience, they've wandered. We've lost them. So listen, thank you all for being here, for sharing your reflections, for sharing your insights, for sharing your families and friends with us. And I am really struck by what the visual medium can do. I think we saw in these pieces the different ways that the visual tells different kinds of stories. It provides different on-ramps into considering this experience that the entire world has lived through. And so for that, I'm deeply appreciative of all of you sharing that and being willing to go on that journey with our wonderful team. I'm gonna do one last kind of moderator prerogative and ask you to just, Pam gave us 3 words earlier. She gave us grief. You didn't give us grief. Sorry, that's a bad way to put it. Let me reframe that. Pam, you invited us to think about sort of grief, hope, and possibility. Was that right?
Anger was-
Oh, anger. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's a possibility. It's a good choice.
Okay, the book we do for. I want you to just take about 10 seconds to wander in your mind. So I can borrow that, Jackie. And are there any other words you want to add as we think about this moment of coming together that has brought us here? About 10 seconds. Okay, I'm going to call on people. Sonali.
Okay, I'm gonna say something that's ridiculously cheesy, but I think the word is love. Like that is like what has literally gotten me through like love from friends and from colleagues and from students and of course from our families. But like that's now I'm gonna cry. But that's like literally like that's like oh you knew this was gonna happen. I'm done. But like that's like isn't that it? Like isn't that at the heart of like what matters? So that's what I'm thinking.
The word that popped into my mind was rebirth. And I'm not even quite sure why, but I think because there is new possibilities and we can really see. Somebody said before, we don't want to go back to everything that happened before because a lot of it wasn't good. And how do we say, what do we really want to hold on to, like connections and our families? And how do we say, what can we change?
This is perhaps a little too in character, but I want to say play. I was thinking about how there was a joke I saw at the beginning that was something along the lines of, people are always saying they wish they had more time to spend with their families, and the gods have sort of called them on that to see if they really think that's true. There was so much time that we spent, there was just first month for sure that it was just me and my wife and my 2 kids in a room, constantly together. And we played so much. We played all these different board games. We watched movies, we played with toys, and we had a lot of fun trying to explore new things together. And that play was really valuable. And I hope that's another thing that we can kind of remember.
Well, Pam said my word. My word's always possibility at the end of talks like this, because possibility is where we want to launch, right? And so maybe I'll add imagination to that, because, there were all of these opportunities to imagine, and sometimes, maybe rarely, but they were able to sort of override some of the grief and some of the anger and some of the frustration, because the imagination was sort of taking us into, maybe it was new ways of connecting with your community, or new recipes to make with your food, or new walks to take. So maybe it's imagination and remembering that that's something that makes new ways possible.
I love that. So for me, the word was pause. And I think one of the things I thought about, not only in terms of this moment and time, but also what your films did for me. They invited me to pause and kind of be still and take in what you were offering. And I think that's a real kind of, maybe not to put too fine a point on it, but when we think about the work that these kinds of tools and technological spaces can do to speed things up, they can also really invite us to pause. So we will pause here. Those of you joining us on YouTube, thank you. We are pausing, but there will be more for you to engage with us. Those of you who are here in the studio, thank you so much for being here. And all 4 of you, and Michelle, thank you for all of your hard work and for trusting us with your stories. Thank you all. Good night.